Actually, my interest in visual arts came from my uh, from my realization that uh, to understand literature more, you need an awareness of visual arts, and not only visual arts. I think literature encompasses all other arts, and I have felt that whatever we do will not be whatever we see, whatever we experience will not be alien to literature teachers like us. The films we see, the music we listen to, the paintings we see, and all these experiences, little bits of experience, finally, they culminate in widening our literary sensibility. And I have been dreaming of this moment for years, when our students could officially uh, start learning, not though not the practice of art, at least the history of visual arts and the aesthetics behind that, and would be able to connect that with the literary studies they make. For example, I have been a member of Lalita Kala Academy executive, and for years we have been struggling to insert this kind of syllabus in school, because what we realize that children, even college students, they know literary figures, most important literary figures, both Indian and Western, and they know about films. They know, of course, some musicians and great singers. But when you come to painters, I doubt how many can name a few painters, either Western or Indian. And this is the case with foreign universities too. And I had the chance of teaching some students from Indiana University. And when I asked about the paintings they had seen, or at least a few American painters they remembered, or a few galleries they stepped in, it was a very, very poor response. Because I think visual arts is the most sidelined and marginalized art form. And the more we learn about visual arts and the aesthetics, the more we understand literature, the nuances of literary creations, and our sensibility will be widened. All of you know that, actually. And I think the greatest apprehension of teachers like us would be, how would students take it up? A course in literature, a interdisciplinary course in visual arts and literature, how would students take it? And when it comes to visual arts, most of the students, most of the parents, and most of us have a feeling that we don't know anything about that. We don't understand most of it. And that was the major contribution of modern art to academy, actually. But what we fail to understand is there is a grammar of visual arts, as there is a grammar in music, as there is a grammar of theater. Of course, you may call it semiotics and all, whatever it be. And without getting initiated into the grammar, we cannot hope to understand the intricacies of or to enhance our enjoyment of visual arts. And the problem is how you can initiate that interest in students. And for that, I think the primary requisite is the kind of passion that teachers have. It is going to be in the syllabus, and we are bound to teach it. So let us go the whole hog, and you get immersed in that, and first you experience that, and I'm sure that will be conveyed to students. Moreover, visual art teaching has one advantage over literary teaching, because it's mostly visual. And today, our culture is predominantly visual, and I'm sure that students will enjoy this this visual experience. And moreover, it can develop their imagination, then a graphic imagination, the faculty of visualization. And this is what I foresee, how in this age of visual culture, when everything is verging towards the idea of design, students would be very much benefited from this kind of syllabus. And what I'm going to do today is not basically focus on the syllabus per se, but I would just share some experiences and insights that I have got. And I think I may have to begin with some of the terms that may help us to tease out a kind of dialogue between visual arts and literature. I hope to share a PowerPoint presentation. See, when we speak about visual arts and the fundamental elements of visual art, and I am going to approach this subject from the point of view of grammar, visual grammar. We begin with lines, actually, dots, then lines and shapes, mass, then color, then space. These are a few, then texture, of course. These are a few terms that we may have to discuss in terms of visual arts. And we will see how we can apply these concepts to literary studies. Now, I'll begin with lines. In visual arts, lines can assume any formation. And some of the formations that are very relevant to literature, I will speak about here. For example, lines can assume a pyramidal structure. It's a basic visual art motif or structure in visual arts, pyramidal. And Gustav Freytag, you must have heard about Freytag diagram. Gustav Freytag, a literary critic, has applied this design to Shakespeare's tragedies, actually. When he spoke about 5-act tragedy, Shakespeare's 5-act tragedies, this is what he formulated. He formulated the whole idea in terms of a diagram, a pyramidal diagram, in which the apex is exactly in the center, the climax. It begins with introduction or exposition, then development, then climax. Climax comes to the top, and then after climax, denouement, anticlimax, and then finally conclusion or catastrophe or conclusion. Now, this was the way he designed. He gave a visual design to Shakespeare's tragedies. And I think we can apply this pyramidal structure to visual art structure to most of the stories. Any story will have this kind of primary structure, beginning with an introduction or exposition and coming to a climax, then finally petering out to an anticlimax and conclusion. But when we come to fiction, for example, or short story or fiction, we can work out this, tweak this diagram in so many ways. For example, in visual arts, this pyramidal structure very often is found in portraits with a broad bottom to a tapering head. This structure, this is by Vermeer self-portrait. And if you are asked what is the composition of this portrait, the composition is pyramidal structure. And this pyramidal structure, as I told you, in literature can be applied to the structuring of stories, the construction of a narrative.
Sir?
Yes?
Sir, can you move on to the next slide, the slide with Vermeer in it? We cannot see that.
Vermeer, you can't see?
No, that is on the slideshow. It's not in the main.
Oh, I don't know.
Sir, can I suggest that you just can you turn off the slideshow mode? Because Google Meet has this weird problem where if you present your screen and it's in slideshow mode, then it doesn't change slides. So we can look at it like this. Yeah, this is better.
Yeah, now we can see.
This is better? Fine. Thank you. Okay. This is Vermeer. self-portrait and the design, I am speaking about the composition, which is pyramidal, and the variations possible. As in music, so many variations are possible in this structure when we apply to literary themes or stories or narratives. On the top is one structure where you find the difference from Vermeer portrait or from the Gustav Freytag diagram to this diagram. You find the difference. Can you spot the difference? In Vermeer, the climax occurs exactly in the middle, whereas here you find the climax occurs in the initial stages of the story. The story builds up to a rapid climax, then there is a prolonged anticlimax, and finally arriving at conclusion. That is one variation possible, pushing the climax to the beginning. And the second variation is, when you postpone the climax, the bulk of the novel, bulk of the story would be a kind of build up, and then we will eventually come to a climax. And after the climax, abruptly the story ends, and leaving a feeling that it could have continued some more. The kind of psychological impact this kind of design can make on the reader, pushing the climax almost towards the end. That is another variation possible. Yet another variation is possible. Here, what is the variation you find? Even before the story had started, the climax had already occurred. The climax had already occurred before the story, and the entire story is a prolonged anticlimax, constantly throwing back onto, preferentially to, the climax that happened before the beginning of the story. And there is a technical, very familiar term for this kind of structure, this kind of design. Can you say that? Do you get it? At every stage, from the beginning to the end, you are looking back to the climax that happened, the crisis that happened. Flashback, exactly. In flashback technique of narration, this is a kind of linear structure, this is the kind of grid that we use. For example, Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter uses this kind of design. And another variation possible. What do you find here? Instead of one narrative, say A, reaching a climax and an anticlimax, and finally conclusion, we have another narrative woven into that, B. Then third narrative, C, woven again into that, and all the three narratives, finally 3 or 4 or any number, converging to a single climax, and then all these characters are caught up in a kind of climactic crisis, and finally the end is common to all of them. The conclusion, the catastrophe and conclusion is common to all of them. Now, there is a very popular novel or popular writer who follows this kind of design. So many stories slowly converge, very gradually converge to a common climax, and then a common ending or common anticlimax. You must have read about Airport, Arthur Haley, Airport, then Hotel. In all these novels, these are the stories of different characters. They have their own spheres, they have their own trajectories, narrative trajectories, but somewhere all these stories converge. Namely, in the case of a crash landing of a plane, that forms a crisis in Haley's novel Airport, and all these characters share the same traumatic experience, crisis, and they are all united in that kind of common experience. It's a very, very, very interesting design. Not yet over. Now we are discussing all these are variations of the linear pyramidal structure possible in literature, coming from visual arts. Yet another design can be like this. It's very, very complicated, very complex. We have one story with one climax and anticlimax. Another story with the same design, pyramidal design. Yet another story, a third story, a fourth story. Now all these narratives, they travel, divergently, but at certain points they converge. They cross each other, they converge, and then they part, and this goes on like that. So many stories are woven and woven together into one grand narrative, and the result of this kind of design is what you call a kind of thick texture. There is a thick texture. Literally, there is a kind of weaving of so many strands of narratives together to create a kind of texture. So you can visualize texture in this form, texture of a story in this form, very, very complicated, complex texture. And the example we can have, our common example is, William Faulkner, for example, As I Lay Dying, As I Lay Dying, or Sound and Fury. Now, so many characters with so many stories, so many narratives are given, and each progresses independently, but they crisscross. They form a crisscross pattern. They converge and they depart. Then again they converge. There are certain points of convergence, and this is how the stream of consciousness novels create a kind of thick texture. When you speak about the texture of a literary text, this is the kind of visualization that is possible. You can speak in terms of texturing. Along with lines, a texture is created. Not yet over. Not yet over. There is one more design possible, like this. This is again a variation of the linear pyramidal structure, but instead of a pyramid, you find a kind of graduated design. Pyramid is a gradual design. The build-up towards the climax is gradual. Instead of the gradual progress of a pyramidal structure, pyramidal narrative, we have here a graduated structure, very artificially put together, and each segment you can cut away. For example, like this, each can be cut into an independent square, and it will be an independent narrative. But something holds all these narratives together, all these units together to form a broad narrative. Now, this is a very artificial structure, but certain literary forms follow this kind of design, this kind of pattern. Instead of a gradual design, we have a graduated design. And the best example can be the episodic adventure novels. For example, Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, Adventures of Robin Hood, Adventures of Phantom, or any adventure story will have this kind of graduated structure, and each adventure is a story in itself, a micro story in itself. And what unifies all these varied, disparate adventures is the fact that it is undertaken by the single hero, the same protagonist features in all these stories. Adventure stories, definitely episodic novels or episodic stories will have this kind of design. So I am actually trying to to show how students can be initiated into visualizing the structure of a literary text. This is a way graphically students can visualize the structure when you speak about that. And when you speak about plot and theme, again, you can show all these things. The difference between theme and plot. Theme is a given story. Say, for example, A, you give to one writer and to another writer B, but then what they make of it, what kind of design like this they make of it, will decide or determine the plot structure. Wherein lies the originality of the writer, not in themes. Themes are only very few. And how people have been engaged in exploring the permutations and combinations of the very few handful of themes human life offers. I think that will be a kind of interesting introduction to the relationship between literature and visual arts. Now, when we come to another component, another linear design that is possible in literature is circular composition. Circular composition, in visual arts you find that kind of composition, and in literary texts also, literary narratives, we have circular compositions, and we call it circular because it begins where it ends. It goes on in an interminable circle, and when the story ends, you have a feeling that the whole thing may repeat, maybe with some slight difference. The whole thing may repeat in a sequential form, and this kind of circularity is very brilliantly explored in fiction, especially in cinema. I remember a short film, Big City Blues, where the whole story, when it ends, the same scenario repeats in a different form with another female character, and you have a feeling that the same thing is going on to happen. And literature also, most of the sequential stories have this kind of circularity. And I'll be back again. At the end of the story, the hero exits with the promise, I'll be back. And that's a kind of opening to a kind of circular continuity. For example, this is a painting by Matisse, The Dance. Henri Matisse, Post-Impressionist painter, The Dance. So the whole design is circular, and you follow these interlocked hands, and they follow a circle, and your eye, you enter the painting through the foreground figure, and your eyes casually effortlessly travel all around into the background and come back to the same starting point, and it doesn't end there. I told you about the interminability of this circularity. It can go on forever and forever. And this kind of maze-like, this kind of seductive maze-like quality, most of the postmodern fiction have. And you have a feeling that this may go on and on. Then this slide shows you another concept in visual arts. I remind you, we are speaking about the grammar of visual arts and how we can apply that grammar to literature or literary text. Now this is a design. This is a logo designed by an art student in a foreign university, design university. And what do you find at first glance? What do you find in this picture? You find a prominent H, which is in white, letter H, which is in white. But if you closely look, H is not there. It is created, the feeling of a letter, English letter H is created by a vacuum, a void. Actually, figures are these four black figures, one S, then another bit, then another bit, and the fourth bit. But when these four black structures are brought together in a particular, spaced together in a particular way, a kind of tension is created between the background, which is white in color, and the color of the figure, which is black. So there is a very strong dialectic between black and white. And not only that, this is the kind of a difficult balance we speak about. That is dialectic. Dialectic speaks about a kind of difficult complementary balance. And this dialectic is the dialectic of what you call gestalt or gestalt. The kind of balance, difficult balance, impossible balance between the background and the foreground figure, the figure and the ground. The two components of a gestalt are figure and ground. No figure can exist without a ground. A figure appears only in a ground. An object appears only in a background. And the kind of interaction between, the kind of tension created between the background and the figure creates this kind of interesting design. And in literature also, you can think of this kind of gestalt where figures and backgrounds merge, coalesce, then diverge, and then once again they merge. A kind of amazing feeling can be created, especially in postmodern fiction, metafiction. We have this kind of use of the confusing imbroglio between foreground and background. And I will show you another design. Of course, we can read that because of our reading habit. What do you read? We read
Pro color.
Pro color, okay. Then why do you read pro color when there is no R? There is no R there. Instead of R, these two, figures are there. We see R where there is no letter R, actually. Because R is created by the background because of the positioning of the foreground figures in this way. The proximity and the juxtaposition of these figures and the spacing of these figures in a particular way creates a letter that is not there. So the background comes forward to form the figure, and in some cases the figure in that case may recede into the background. The interminable duet that can take place between, I am using the musical metaphor consciously, that can happen between the foreground and the background. Very often you find, we are told, in the compositions of Bach, a modernist musician, composer Bach. In fact, there is a wonderful book, interdisciplinary book on Escher, Bach, and Gödel. Gödel is a mathematician, Escher is an artist, French artist, and Gödel, we know, is a mathematician, and Bach is a musician. Now, Rosenthal, he is the author, and the author is speaking about Bach, that in Bach's compositions, the harmony will very often come to the foreground to form the melody, and inversely the melody will recede into the background, forming a kind of harmony. The reversibility, the reflexivity, the reversibility between, the recursivity between harmony and melody is what you find in the visual art practices of people like Escher. Recursibility, interminable recursibility between figure and background. And I will show you another picture with the same theme, speaking about the positive space, negative space, or the figure background gestalt, how interesting it can become. Can you read?
Mailbox.
Mailbox, of course. What is interesting is there is not a single letter here. All are very funny figures. If you focus on the black figures, they are the figures actually. In a white background, these black meaningless figures are deployed, and they are positioned in a particular way that the background, I told you, advances to the foreground and forms a visual feel of these letters, MAIL, then VOX, mailbox. This interesting way, this kind of dialectic can form very interesting design. Very interesting design. And this is Escher. I told you about in the book Escher, Bach, and Gödel. The writer compares Escher's paintings to Bach's musical compositions, and also Gödel's mathematical theorems, actually. Now, this is one drawing by Maurice Escher, French artist. Now, if you look at this picture, obviously the black figures are there, they are foregrounded. So figures are black in color. But when you focus on the background, what do you find? Is there a distinct background to this picture? Is there a distinct background? No. When you focus on the background, the background becomes the figure. The background advances and they assume the position of figures. And, subsequently the foreground black figures merge into the background. So the figure ground eternal interaction, one coming forward, the other receding, and this kind of rhythmic dance between the figure and the ground is a spatial interest that visual arts can create by playing on positive space and negative space. I told you this is the kind of playful interactions you find in most postmodern fiction, where you are totally confused between the location and the drama, the locale and the drama, or the site and the specific action that takes place there. For example, if on a winter's night a traveler, there are so many stories like that. Now, this is actually the way you can speak about the use of space. The use of space, how space can be thought of as including a figure in a background. In most realist fiction, they practice a kind of technique called focalization or foregrounding. Now, this is a kind of foregrounding I'm speaking about. You foreground a figure and then the rest merges into the background. And when you foreground the background, they advance towards us. And this kind of effect can be created. And it began, I think, in fiction with the advent of Impressionism. And Impressionism, Impressionism is very much atmospheric. It is soaked in atmospheric feeling, where the atmosphere is a character, where the location and the atmosphere and the moment of experience is very crucial in an Impressionist writing. For example, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. And Waves, I think, is in the syllabus. If you study Waves, you will feel that. Every moment, every passing moment, every nuance of emotion is related to every passing moment, every passing color, every passing experience. And that's why modern fiction began to believe in sensibility as a huge spider web, catching every airborne particle into it. The comprehensive sensibility of a writer. Henry James spoke about a huge spider web. Sensibility or imagination is a huge spider web, catching every airborne particle to it. Nothing is alien to human imagination, especially the secondary imagination of a writer. And the same idea Virginia Woolf expressed in her statement that in her famous lines, life is not a series of jig lamps symmetrically arranged. It's a vast luminous halo enveloping all our being from the beginning. And this is a kind of inclusive imagination that can create this kind of interesting equations between foreground and background. And there are certain narratives in which you cannot think of the story without the background. For example, Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Without that marine background, without that vastness of the sea, vastness of the oceans, you can't think of the story taking place. The whole verisimilitude of the story is created by pushing the story into a remote, far remote space beyond human imagination, where you feel that anything can happen. Anything can happen. And that is where the backgrounds become very prominent, very decisive in decoding the narrative, in understanding the narrative. Now, this is another crucial concept in visual arts. This introduces another crucial concept in visual arts called the perspective. Perspective. Now, all of us must have experienced a similar experience. We stand in between two railway lines. We know they run parallel. We know conceptually they run parallel. They never meet. But your eyes tell you they meet at a distant point, in a remote point. We know they never meet, but this is what our eyes tell us. They meet at a remote point. So in visual arts, it was Renaissance artists who invented perspective as a technique of rendering visual realism into art, in art. And they invented perspective, the theory of perspective, which is premised on the existence of a point which they called vanishing point. Now, if you can imagine a point where these two parallel lines meet in the distant horizon, we would call it the vanishing point. Why is it called the vanishing point? Because you never reach it. The moment you try to reach it, it will recede again. Like Will of the Wisp, it will go on receding forever. You will never be able to capture it. But your entire visual reality, your experience of the visual world is predicated on this point, which is non-existent. That's the fun of it. The point never exists, but human perception of visual reality is based on this non-existent point. And that's how it becomes transcendental in one sense. Though it's hypothetical, that point is transcendental because it constructs our visual reality for the world, objective reality, based on a point that never has any objective existence at all. Now, this point is very important to construct, as I told you, scenes of visual reality. And the ramifications of this theory are very interesting. And resorting to a vanishing point, the artist or the photographer or the writer is offering his or her perspective of reality, slice of reality. It is framed in a single, perception. And that is why it's called perspectival. And here, there is only one vanishing point. And so this is a picture using single perspective, monocular perspective. This is classical monocular perspective where the vanishing point is exactly in the center. Now, this was ever since Renaissance, our idea of visual reality was constructed on this kind of structure. With the perspective, single perspective of the artist or the writer, with the vanishing point converging exactly in the middle. And it was with the advent of modernism, like Cubism absolutely did away with this idea of visual reality based on perspective. They rejected perspective altogether. And the history of modernism it starts with a tendency to reject this idea of perspective. And how perspective is used in literature. When you think of Robert Browning, for example, Browning's dramatic monologues. Say, for example, Fra Lippo Lippi. Now, why do we call Fra Lippo Lippi a dramatic monologue? What is so dramatic about it? It is a monologue. It is only, the first diagram is only two-dimensional. Of a cube, it's only two-dimensional. It's only a diagram. But the moment you assume a perspective, the diagram becomes very dramatic. It assumes a solidity. It assumes a solidity, a specificity, and hence it becomes very dramatic. Now, Philippi or any dramatic monologue, Porphyria's Lover, Philippi, Rabbi Ben Ezra, any dramatic monologue by Browning belongs to the second category of design, where the whole situation is offered in a very dramatic, solid, concrete form. Now, it is not as simple as that. It is slightly complex, more complex, because in the second diagram, when you compare these two diagrams, the first one and the second perspectival diagram, in the second diagram, you get an additional information. I am giving you an additional information which maybe I did not intend to give you. I am passing on to you some information, vital information, which was not my intention to convey, but you get it. You get it. The obvious information is about the object, that is the square, about the object, that cube, but some additional information I give you. What is that additional information? Because when you look at the second diagram, you know exactly where I stood when I saw it. You can pinpoint the position, viewing position of the artist at the moment of perception. You can decide, you can say that I must have stood below the object because you see the bottom. And you can also say I must have stood on the right of the object because you see the right side. It is three-dimensional, it is solid. Along with the frontal view, you see the bottom and also one side. So this information I did not want to convey to you, my position. If you look at, My Last Duchess, the Duke is speaking very plainly about his last Duchess to the emissary, to the ambassador who came with a marriage proposal. The obvious objective of the Duke is to depict the Duchess in a very, very, demeaning way to the emissary. But listening to his speech, the emissary understands the character of the Duke more than that of the Duchess. The Duke is betraying himself or exposing himself without his knowing it. Without his knowing it. It's intensely psychological, and hence it is dramatic, and it is monologue because originally the Duke speaks and the listener listens to as the viewer looks at a perspectival drawing. But a moment comes in this kind of perspectival viewing, a moment comes when the viewer pushes the artist away and assumes his standpoint to look at the picture. Now, when you see this second diagram, you assume my position to see it like this. So the viewer assumes the sovereignty of the artist to understand, to perceive it in that way, and that is the additional, surplus value the perspectival pictures have for the viewer. Limitation is that he doesn't have a choice. You don't have a choice. You have to accept my perspective. That is a limitation. But the advantage is that, or the important point is that in accepting this kind of limitation, you are overcoming that limitation by pushing the artist away and assuming his standpoint. In other words, the spectator assumes the same kind of sovereignty as the author had at the moment of perception, original perception. And this is the kind of sovereignty that films offer to a film viewer. This is the kind of sovereignty that films invest the viewer with. Hence the popularity of films. In the darkness of the theater, every viewer is a sovereign subject, viewing this kind of drama without the fourth wall. And we will discuss that, or you will discuss that when you come to a comparison of films and literature. Now, in this photograph, again we are speaking about space in visual arts. This photograph is very interesting because it uses different levels of space. Say, for example, when you speak about space, that sprawls before you, in front of you, horizontally, the space can be divided into foreground, middle ground, and background. And an interesting principle in composition, visual composition in photography and in painting is that you cannot jump to a middle ground and background without a proper foreground frame. Imagine you are shooting a sea, beach, and vast expanse of a sea and sky. You must have some foreground object to frame the whole thing. Otherwise, it would be like a kind of jump cut in cinema. You are just jumping into middle space. Now, here in this photograph, it's an interesting photograph because it has a continuity of space. We have in the foreground this tree. From the side of this tree as a frame, you are entering the painting, the scene, photograph, and the field is a middle ground. The field is middle ground, and you can find the skyline in the background. So we have foreground, middle ground, then background. But the photograph is interesting because there is an element of composition that connects these three spaces. That stitches. In film language, a kind of stitching is done between these three spaces. This is the path, the narrow path. The narrow path begins from the foreground, traverses the middle ground, and finally into a vanishing point, it recedes in the background. So in literature, very often you think of certain passages, you think of the way how these three spaces are stitched together. I have two examples. I remind you of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. In Ode to a Nightingale, there is a passage where Keats speaks about magic casements opening on to perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Imagine the poet is standing on top of a tower, inside a tower, and the tower faces a raging sea. There's a vast moonlit expanse of the sea, and there is a window, a small window, which the poet opens, and the sight he sees in front is so magical, so romantic and magical, so captivating, and that is experience Keats speaks about. Magic casements opening on to perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. No, the poet is in the foreground. The poet is a foreground figure. He's a perceiver of the scene. And the middle ground is the window. The window is in the middle ground, forming a frame. And the poet is looking through the frame into the background, which is so seductive. And the whole experience is stitched together as a kind of dreamy or romantic experience of the poet. Magic casements opening on to perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Now, a similar passage you have in T.S. Eliot. In T.S. Eliot, I think it's in the second section, Game of Chess, where the rich lady's chamber, very rich chamber is described. Now, Eliot describes all the sumptuousness, all the luxury of that room of the character, item by item, the chandelier and all these things, and perfumes, emanating to the roof in fumes, and the giddy smell of the perfumes in the atmosphere. But interestingly, it comes to a point where he speaks about this kind of framing. The lines are these: above the antique mantle, as though a window gave upon a sylvan scene, the change of Philomel so rudely forced by the barbarous king. Still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug jug to dirty ears. Now, above the antique mantle, there is a mantle place, there is a fireplace which is very antique to show her, that resplendent existence. Above the antique mantle, as though a window gave upon a sylvan scene. From the room, you come to the painting, and each painting is a very interesting thing about visual arts. Each painting is a frame opening on to here a very, very romantic story. And what is a romantic story? The romantic story is the story of a very barbarous rape by Tyreus, the rape of Philomela. And interestingly, the rape of Philomela formed a consistent theme in visual arts, Western visual arts, the rape scene. And Philomela became, the Nightingale story became a barometer of the changing sensibility of art and literature through centuries. And when we come to 20th century, the story of Philomela becomes a titillating story for the jaded sensibility of a modern man because of its sexual content, because it involves a rape. Still the world pursues, jug jug to dirty ears. We listen to the Philomela story, dirty ears. But anyway, the kind of positing that painting as a window opening on to a kind of mythic world is very interesting. This is how these different spaces can be brought into juxtaposition and with a different kind of feel as a window, the middle ground as a window, as a springboard to something fantastic. And where you think of the frame, here is a kind of frame, beautiful framing between the real and the marvelous. Inside the room is a real, and beyond the room is a marvelous, and the inside and the outside are brought together with this window as a frame. Now, this is another concept in visual arts called the rule of the third. Rule of the third. Rule of the third is a theory. It's also the way you deploy space, where you position important elements in a composition. It says that a frame can be divided into 3 equal parts, vertically and horizontally. And the most important point or object should be placed on any 4 points of intersection, as about here, the lowest, right side point of intersection, any point of intersection, these 4 points, or any third line, it comes on the right side third line and this point, and this is the central figure. And if we had placed the board exactly in the center, this would have become a very boring composition. So the way you place the object, the figure, in a composition is very important. And rule of the third is one classical convention in photography and in painting. Now we have this rule of the third brilliantly followed in a painting by Brugel, Fall of Icarus. Fall of Icarus. And Brugel painted this painting, an early Renaissance painter, even pre-Renaissance painter, Brugel, the story of Icarus, who was ambitious, who was ambitious enough to attempt a flight towards the sun, and his waxen wings were melted, and he fell into the Sea of Dardanelles. Now, this painting supposedly is about Icarus, but you don't find Icarus as an important figure anywhere in the composition. This man is a peasant, a tiller tilling the ground, and we have a shepherd looking after the sheep. We have a ship flying by. Where is Icarus? Icarus is only this. a tiny portion of the canvas, a tiny speck of the canvas, speck on the canvas with his one leg protruding above the sea. The rest has gone down. He is drowning. The act of drowning is captured in this painting. Icarus is relegated to this position. Though, for a common viewer, Icarus is made insignificant, visibly insignificant by this positioning. Composition-wise, Brugel has Icarus in a very strategic point towards the lower third point. And in that way, Icarus becomes the central character, not this shepherd or this tiller or this farmer. Now, an interesting thing about this painting is that you must have read Audin's poem on this painting, Musée des Beaux-Arts. Audin once visited this painting in a gallery in Brussels, and he was impressed by Brugel's sensibility, and Audin shared Brugel's sensibility, and he wrote a poem about this painting called The Fall of Icarus, and the title of the poem is Musée des Beaux-Arts, Museum of Modern Arts. Now, the kind of affinity that Audin had with Brugel was that Brugel depicts the world as unconcerned about this magnificent failure of mankind. A teenager, a young boy, aspired to fly towards the sun. He failed, of course, but it was a magnificent failure. And the world goes on trying their routine, unconcerned about this human tragedy. Now, Audin himself shared this kind of sensibility. For example, if you read In Memory of W.B. Yeats, a mighty poet, is dying. And there is a very clinical description of how death encroaches the body of W.B. Yeats. Death invaded the suburbs, he says, and finally marching towards headquarters, that is his heart or head. Now, as W.B. Yeats lay dying far off in the deserts or far off in the forest, wolves ran on howling. Wolves ran on howling. The world went on, engaging themselves in the daily routines, unconcerned about the passing away of a mighty poet. So they had a shared sensibility, and Audin responded in terms of that point. Now, I mentioned this painting and Audin's poem because it introduces another interesting interdisciplinary concept between visual arts and literature called ekphrasis. Audin's poem, you can say, is an ekphrastic poem. Now, an ekphrasis is this: when one work of art takes up as its subject another work of art, you can say the practice is ekphrastic. Now, Audin's poem itself is a work of art, and the subject of that poem is another work of art, another painting, that is Brugel's Fall of Icarus. So Audin's poem is an ekphrastic poem. And ekphrasis is an interesting concept in the interdisciplinary or intermediate studies between visual arts and literature. Another ekphrastic reference I will make in Caravaggio, Conversion of Saint Paul. Now, Caravaggio was a Baroque painter, before Renaissance. After Renaissance, of course. Baroque, immediately succeeding to Renaissance. Now, Caravaggio's theme is a conversion of Saint Paul. Saint Paul was a persecutor of Christians called Saul, King Saul. And one day, God, as he was marching to persecute a community of Christians, God appeared before him in light, and he was blinded in that vision, and he fell from horseback. And as a result of this shocking experience, he was converted. That characterized the moment of conversion for Saint Paul. He became Saint Paul later. Now, this theme of the fall of Saint Paul, Caravaggio shifted to inside of a stable. a cloistered space, interior of a stable. And instead of the whole army witnessing the tragedy in the real story, actual story in the Bible, here there are only two witnesses, one the ostler and the two hosts. The prominent space of the canvas is dedicated to the horse, with his front leg raised to kick the fallen hero, because the horse represents the power of God, the might of God. And Caravaggio is concerned about the gesture of Saint Paul, raising his hands, and he speaks about Caravaggio like you wily craftsman, you wily craftsman. Because the whole gesture is very ambiguous. Is he welcoming that vision, manifestation of God in that vision, or is he trying to block that kick? It is not sure. So there is an ambiguity in that gesture, and Caravaggio calls Tom Gunn in the poem Santa Maria del Popolo. He saw this painting, Tom Gunn saw this painting in that church, and he addresses Caravaggio saying, you wily craftsman. Caravaggio is called wily craftsman. He finds interesting nuances in this posture, which is Baroque. And when you mention Baroque, this is an ekphrastic instance where Tom Gunn translates a whole narrative into a poem in Santa Maria del Popolo. Now, ekphrasis, you remember? And another interesting aspect of this painting, I mentioned Baroque, because in art history, Baroque is very important. T.S. Eliot began as a Baroque poet. And I feel that he was predominantly a Baroque poet. He was very fond of a Baroque architect, Christopher Wren. And in photography, cinematography, we all refer to the Baroque contribution, which is a contribution of light and shade, what you call technically chiaroscuro. Now, chiaroscuro, the use of light and shade, is another technique in visual arts. Light and shade. And the use of light and shade was introduced by the Baroque artists for the first time. You find the painting, shows how light and shade are used in this painting very, very creatively. And the master of light and shade painting, chiaroscuro painting, was Rembrandt. Rembrandt, a Baroque painter. This is self-portrait. And if you look at this self-portrait, it was unprecedented. The kind of lighting was unprecedented. When you compare Rembrandt's portraits with the portraits of Da Vinci or whatever it be, Renaissance portraits, the use of light in this way was very unprecedented. Now here, the highlight falls only on very selective parts of the body. Parts of the face is lit up. The other areas merge into darkness. Light and shade is very dramatically used. Chiaroscuro is very dramatically used. And in photography today, there is a kind of lighting called Rembrandt lighting. Rembrandt lighting is lateral 45-degree lighting, where you are etched as a statue. One side is completely lit up, the other side merges into darkness. Very, very dramatic lighting. In cinema also, especially in expressionist cinema, and in film noir films, dark films, we use this kind of lighting called chiaroscuro lighting or Rembrandt lighting. So the contribution of Baroque to visual arts. In literature also. In literature, the kind of use of light and shade. I remember one statement made by George Eliot. About George Eliot. Now, with George Eliot, with her fiction, characters could not be any more divided into good men and bad men. Every character is a mixture of good and bad. Even her protagonists have certain drawbacks. And even Shakespeare, our bard, had this kind of tragic flow in his mind when he portrayed great heroes. So this use of negative sides and heroic qualities, mixing these two, creating an interesting visual texture of chiaroscuro, has been very common in literature. And ever since George Eliot, this became very prominent in modern realist fiction, as opposed to the fiction of Trollope, Thackeray, Dickens, where white is white and black is black, like that. So the psychological insight, how psychological insight mixes black and white in characters, in literature, how it began to appear in characterization. It's very interesting, actually. Then, this is a painting belonging to the Romantic period, Delacroix, Liberty Leading People. French painter Delacroix, Liberty Leading People. And this is in the syllabus. I saw it is mentioned as a primary text. And Delacroix was a French painter. And this painting was not obviously about French Revolution, but what happened after that, a kind of June Revolution, after the French Revolution. But this painting became so celebrated and famous that this became a kind of synonym with French Revolution and the ideas of liberty, fraternity, equality, and all. And here, this painting has inspired even music. There was even a symphony composed, inspired by this painting by Delacroix, Liberty. And so many painters themselves were influenced by this expression of freedom, expression of liberty. Liberty epitomized as a sensuous lady, very, very physically present there, leading with a tricolor flag, which later became the flag of French Republic, leading people, comprising of all categories of society, all communities of society. There is a revolutionary young man, rebel with a gun, a teenage man. There is another one, a kind of dandy carrying a kind of rifle, and there are working class people. So how people are united, and that spirit of freedom and liberty, we know inspired Coleridge. And Coleridge's Fall of Bastille is again prescribed as a primary text in syllabus. Fall of Bastille. Now, Coleridge expresses the hope of humanity in this kind of expression of liberty, even violence erupting, promising a bright future for mankind. We can even think of Shelley's Republican spirits, how he affiliated himself with French Revolution. And when you speak about Romanticism, especially British Romanticism, the first generation of Romantic poets, French Revolution is very much in the background. If you remember Wordsworth began as a poet, whipped up by his enthusiasm for French Revolution, but later he became disillusioned. As it dipped into a kind of bloodbath, Wordsworth became disillusioned. Coleridge also, with his idea of pantisocracy, with his idea of absolute liberty and all, he was also a supporter of French Revolution. And Blake, the best romantic of the lot, the best of the lot, William Blake, even wrote an epic called the French Revolution, a visionary epic called French Revolution. And we have another painting by Jericho, The Raft of Medusa, similar in composition, speaking about the plight of a slave ship, how the captain, the skipper, and the mates abandoned the sinking slaves. It was wrecked, and the captain, deserted the ship. And there was a hue and cry, in the parliament, but the captain, I think, I don't know whether he was punished or not, but for 7 days, these slaves were left to starve, without water, without food. And here is one black man, the revolutionary aspect is one Negro lifting a cloth as a flag, waving for rescue. The whole composition has been celebrated as a plea for emancipation of the downtrodden, inspired by the Jericho painting. And another aspect of romanticism, when you speak about romanticism, nature, for example, pantheism, you speak about romantic poets as worshippers of nature, but this was actually a very, very gradual process. The romantics became aware of the presence of nature by a time when nature was disappearing from their social experiences due to industrial revolution. And if you read pre-romantic poets like Blake, they lament the plight of industrial revolution, chimney sweeps, and songs of experience. And even Wordsworth's poem London Bridge, London 1802, as he walks on London Bridge, how Thames for a moment is free from all the pollution of civilization. Now, they became acute of the presence of nature when they became aware that nature is fast vanishing. Pristine purity of nature is lost. And one important painter who has inspired romantic poets was John Constable. John Constable, a landscape painter. Landscape became a genre, actually, a very serious genre in the Romantic period, along with the Romantic poets celebrating nature. And in the case of Wordsworth, it went beyond a mere celebration of visual nature. If you use Spinoza's terms, from natura naturans, from natura naturata, Wordsworth's growth was to natura naturans. When you come to the later poetry of Wordsworth, nature becomes actually a shaping spirit itself, a universal power, a shaping power, that is natura naturans. Natura naturata is manifested world, whereas natura naturans is the power that shapes the world. And if you read Immortality or then Tintern Abbey, you find this kind of apotheosis of nature into a shaping power. And from John Constable, if you come to Turner, you find how nature gradually becomes ethereal, becomes abstract to form a kind of energy, very, very kinetic energy. This is Turner, one of early paintings of Turner's Tintern Abbey. Tintern Abbey, which was also a theme for Wordsworth. You must have studied Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Turner painted this before Wordsworth wrote Tintern Abbey. The interest of the Romantic poets with the exotic, with the remote in time and space, with the ruins, with the dark shadows of life, the nether experiences of life, with the fantasy world, with the marvelous, all these things come to our mind. This is Turner, one of the later paintings of Turner, Snowstone. See, even as early as Romantic period, there is a kind of abstraction. Turner was trying to actually depict the quintessence of a stone, his experience of stone. It was not the visual nature that was very important, but the impact of the violence and the energy of nature on the poet. Now, it was Turner in this sense who became a predecessor of the later European movement called Impressionism, where what mattered was not the objective reality of the world, but the impression the world created on the artist or the poet. So Turner was actually a kind of bridge towards Impressionism, the next important 19th century, Fagan 19th century movement, Turner. And here is Goya, another Romantic painter, Goya, Colossus. Now Goya actually depicted the sense of mystery and all the dark experiences of romantic sensibility, romantic psyche. And Goya was actually, he was a war painter also. He saw the horrors of war and he documented the horrors of war. He has several war sketches depicting the horrors of war. And he was a kind of broad humanitarian in that sense, and also obsessed with these dark forces of the unconscious. Colossus is a representation. Colossus, then Saturn eating her son, and all these paintings are a manifestation of the dark human unconscious. We come to Blake. I mentioned Blake. Blake was also a powerful painter, and here is his Ghost of a Flea. As a romantic painter, Blake had visions, and he depicted these visions. And here is a vision of evil, necessary evil. And Blake's brilliant compromise is the acceptance of evil as a part of the divine scheme. That is why he wrote Songs of Experience after writing Songs of Innocence. And in a world, lambs are not enough, but tigers are also needed. The wrath of God, angry God. And in a world, that vision, the comprehensive vision wouldn't be complete without descending into the hell of human unconscious, the other side of man. And most of his visions have this kind of darker side, and Blake makes an interesting psychoanalytical reading. Another painting by Blake, Newton. How Romanticism, when you speak about Romanticism, how romantic period in English literature advocated intuition, favored or prioritized intuition over intellect, imagination over reason. And for Blake, I told you, imagination was the primal bosom to which you return, from which you are born and to which you return. He ascribed a certain sanctity, divinity to imagination. Whereas, this is science doing, Newton representing rationality, human reason doing, measuring the world with a compass, that's all. Forgetting the whole world around him, he stooped in reducing the whole world into a small diagram on the paper. Now, from Blake, from Romanticism, when you come to symbolism, we have painters like Gustave Moreau, Jupiter and Semele, highly symbolic. And we have Victor Vasnatso, a Russian painter, The Night at the Crossroads, heavily symbolic. Every item is symbolic. Now, this symbolist movement in visual arts actually was inspired by French symbolist poets. When you teach French symbolist poets, when you read French symbolist poets like Mallarmé, Verlaine, Rimbaud, now these for these poets, symbolism was a very problematic term when you use symbolism for that. Normally, when you think of symbolism, you have a concrete image standing as a symbol for some quality. Whereas in symbolist movement in poetry, the very emotion, the very passing nuance of an emotion, passing emotion is taken up as a symbol of something else. The whole experience is etherealized on a second level semiosis, as if you remember Roland Barthes, second order semiosis, where the signifier of the first order becomes a signifier in itself. Now, an object signifies an emotion, whereas when you come to symbolist poetry, that very emotion becomes a signifier, and it's very thick in that. The whole thing is so etherealized. And Rimbaud and Mallarmé, they were very strong forces. Even Baudelaire, Le Flou du Mal, who was a central figure among the inaugurators of the modern movement. And symbolist movement in painting always got inspired from French symbolist poetry. And when we come to Rossetti, Proserpina, or Proserpine, we extend that symbolism. Rossetti was a pre-Raphaelite painter who was a founder of pre-Raphaelite movement. But the pre-Raphaelite paintings, though they began with a heavy accent on on realism, actual visual realism. Finally, what happened was this extreme focus on realism tended to fragment itself and verge towards or move towards symbolism. You find that kind of tension between symbolism and realism in Rossetti in most paintings, pre-Raphaelite paintings. Extremely sensuous model, Mary Jane, Jane Morris. Extremely sensuous. The voluptuousness of the model is very evident. The figure is so voluptuous, enticingly voluptuous and sensuous, with a pomegranate in her hand, half-slit pomegranate. The entire thing is symbolic, and Proserpine, we know, was abducted by Pluto into the underworld. Here Proserpine is in the underworld, and for a moment she has a glimpse of an outside world. She looks furtively towards that opening, that slit in the wall, and the light falls in the background, forming a frame where you find an ivy leaf creeping, and that stands for memory, and every object is having a heavy load of symbolism there. And the shadows are the shadows of hell, of Pluto's world, resembling Plato's myth of the cave. And I think Rossetti Proserpine is prescribed in the syllabus. Another picture, Beta Beatrice Rossetti, how Beatrice conducted Dante into the underworld, and the painting is based on Dante actually. So many paintings he painted on Divine Comedy, and this is one, heavily symbolic, sensuous and symbolic at the same time. And the sensuousness you find, most sensuous depiction of female models you find in pre-Raphaelite movement, and at the same time highly symbolic, very, very, paradoxical. This is the most celebrated painting, Ophelia, by Millais. Elizabeth Siddal was the model, and extreme realism Millais actually rendered there. Every flower and every leaf is so lifelike. And the model Elizabeth Siddal was forced to lie in a tub full of water for him to sketch for days together. And she even contracted a fever, we are told, as a result of this posing. But the whole thing, tends towards symbolism. Every flower is symbolic, every leaf is symbolic. Now, this painting, Amritha Shergill, ancient storyteller, is actually included in the syllabus among post-impressionist group in that section. But I have my own doubts regarding this, because Amritha Shergill, she began as a post-impressionist. She was European educated. She was educated in France in the closing days of 19th century. And she was actually influenced by the Impressionists, and the early paintings show influence of Impressionism. But here, she came to India and she was attracted to Gandhian principles, and she was attracted to Indian life. She decided to stay back in India, and she undertook a study of Indian murals and miniatures. And if you look at the foliage in the background, the whole thing shows, and this background figure here shows influence of Indian miniatures actually, rather than Impressionist qualities. But anyway, Amritha Shergill somehow belonged to that period. She began as a painter during that period. Then she went on, progressing towards a kind of Indian realities. This is one of the miniatures of Rajput tradition. Vasant Ragini Ragamala paintings. When you speak about the interrelationship between visual arts and literature, visual arts and music, in Indian background there were interesting experiments, especially during the miniature period. Indian artists, Rajput artists, had undertaken very interesting experiments in translating Hindustani ragas into rendering Hindustani ragas into visual art form. There are exquisite paintings called Ragamala paintings. Every Hindustani raga or ragini, they try to depict its mood, its time of day, its month, its season, with human emotions and human narratives. And this is how they entered different Hindustani ragas into painting form. This is Ragini Vasant, a raga, female raga, Ragini, as a visual art form. Ragamala paintings, they offer interesting study, the interaction between music and painting. This was actually the inaugural painting of Impressionism, Claude Monet, Impression Sunrise. Now, I think the syllabus as such begins with modernist movements. We don't go back to Renaissance or Baroque or it begins with Romanticism, of course, 19th century movements. And Romanticism, in a way, you can consider a kind of, pre-modern period, actually, immediately preceding modernist movements. But modernism proper begins with Impressionism, which appeared towards the fag end of 19th century. And the word was given to this movement on account of this painting by Claude Monet, Impression Sunrise. I don't go into the detailed history of this movement or paintings like that. But what you see here is, for the first time, the elemental forces of nature become powerful. That is why I told Turner is a bridge to Impressionism. British painter Turner actually became a predecessor to Impressionism. Now, in Monet's work, human element is practically nil, just a tiny bit. As in Brugel's painting, just a tiny bit here, just a silhouette here, tiny silhouette. But nature is so important. And nature not as supposed to exist objectively, but nature as perceived by the artist at one particular moment, particular time of day, that is morning. And the theme is actually sunlight, how sunlight is caught in reflection in the sea. Now, this actually introduces so many. Pardon? This painting introduces so many interesting ideas about modernist art and modernist literature. For the first time, this kind of intense subjectivity introduces a kind of self-reflexivity. This is a time when in visual arts, there was a shift, very remarkable shift from the theory of mimesis to theory of reflexivity. Theory of mimesis gives way to theory of reflection. Art is not an imitation of life, imitation of objective, mirror-like imitation of life. Art is an expression of life. Whose life? The artist's life. Artist's perception of life. Artist's impression of life. Now, this element of self-reflexivity, you find begins to appear in literature also. In the novels of Henry James, in the novels of Virginia Woolf, remarkable impressionist perception of the world. How the writer perceives the entire color spectrum of experience, and how every passing moment becomes very significant in the whole trajectory of human experience. Moment by moment, minute by minute, how reality is transformed. And it was at this moment that the idea of a monolithic reality was utterly demolished. If sunlight becomes the subject of a painting, then sunlight has the power to fragment any object to tiny atoms of light. Sunlight is the most democratic. It shines equally on a piece of stone, art stone, a criminal, or a king. And that kind of broad democracy is depicted in nature, giving equal importance. I told you in the beginning, you remember, I told you about background and foreground, and that kind of treatment was given in Impressionism. Equal importance to background, figure, and ground. The gestalt becomes very thick with equal application. thick texturing of the background and the foreground elements. All these things you find in Impressionist paintings, and you find in Impressionist writing also. A basic, beautiful novel. I am so happy that Vase is prescribed. So beautiful, so haunting. Another Impressionist painting, The Swing. See, I told you how any object can be fragmented into tiny atoms of light. Sunlight is the important subject here, not these persons. And when you think about sunlight constituting a kind of reality, how fickle that reality would be, because sunlight is so unsteady. This kind of scene you can find only in one particular moment in life. Next moment, the people may change, the pose may change, lighting may change. So Impressionism in that sense became the articulation of a very contingent reality. Reality is so contingent. Reality is so provisional. That kind of intense subjectivity, self-reflexivity, you can find in the writings of the period also, the beginning of modernism. Another Renoir painting, The Scene at Asnières. Here, how reality is fragmented into tiny bits of light, atoms of light. But the whole thing becomes so dreamy, and the background and the figure, they are given equal treatment. There's a kind of dialectic operating, visual dialectic between the background and the foreground, and the importance of sunlight and the fragmentation of reality. With Vincent Van Gogh, we come to Post-Impressionism. I think the prescribed portion in the syllabus, Post-Impressionism. Vincent Van Gogh is a key figure where technique is Impressionist, but subject matter slightly very seriously moves away from the typical Impressionist concern about very easeful life outdoors. Subject matter becomes, the articulation of a traumatic self, a traumatic experience. Best example is Vincent Van Gogh, who committed suicide, who had bouts of insanity. Very interesting. I don't have time to go in detail on Vincent Van Gogh. This was the last painting he painted, wheat field with cross. Look at the thick texturing, the background and the foreground, the figures, the cross and all. But what matters is the violence of the whole, visual violence. The visual violence, I spoke about the texture. For the first time, texture becomes visible only with Impressionist paintings in Western art. And this is how, in fiction also, thick texturing becomes a fashion. Now, Virginia Woolf, the way is I read out a passage, prescribed passage from Virginia Woolf. You read that, suddenly a river snatches a blue light. The earth absorbs color like a sponge, slowly drinking water. It puts on weight, rounds itself, hangs pendant, settles, and swings beneath our feet. So the landscape returned to me. So I saw the fields rolling in waves of color beneath me. All the background. Very meticulous detail. The background is depicted, not realistically, but impressionistically. How the writers saw these. And look at the color scheme, the brilliant chromatic color scheme of the scene. From me had dropped the old clock, the old response, the hollowed hand that beats back sounds, etc. The last sentence, I who have made so many unattended, I who have always gone with my kind, solitary, I who have always had someone to share the empty grate on the cupboard with its hanging loop of gold. Like a magician capturing strands from the air, loose strands, fictitious strands from hair. She is trying to weave the totality of it. Pardon? Now, this painting is also in the syllabus, Edward Munch, The Scream, introducing expressionism. I told you about the shift from mimesis to expressiveness, and how the painter was obsessed with expressing his own inner angst. This was actually a manifestation of his own psyche, disturbed psyche. The figure. The very interesting thing about this painting is that this such kind of sea or such kind of river or sky you can never find in life. With expressionism, colors become arbitrary, and figuration becomes arbitrary and distorted, because life itself became very, very traumatic. Post First World War scenario, life was actually miserable. And the misery of life, all the hardships of life, misery of life, anxieties of life, especially the anxieties of man-woman life, all these themes you can find in expressionist movement paintings. Oppression, suppression, persecution, insanity. And Cabinet of Caligari, a film mentioned in the syllabus, prescribed in the syllabus, the theme is insanity actually. Insanity is irrationality. All these are dominant themes in expressionist movement. And if you read Kafka, another prescribed text, Kafka's Metamorphosis, Castle, or any writing by Kafka, you can find how he tries to articulate all these themes, all these disturbing themes. Another painting by Max Beckmann, City Night, very disturbing, suffocating, claustrophobic space. Now, when you spoke about space, Metamorphosis uses a claustrophobic space. The whole thing takes place inside a room. Castle introduced a claustrophobic space. And I can remember Edgar Allan Poe, Follow the House of Usher, extremely a claustrophobic space. Now, how space becomes very important in narratives, in literary narratives. And it coincided with this kind of use of space, claustrophobic space, in expressionist paintings like that of Max Beckmann. And the articulation of violence, extreme violence, a neo-expressionist painter, Gregory Gillespie, Monument for a Vietnam Shrine. So explicit in the articulation of violence. Now, this is from an expressionist, German expressionist poem, Dodek by George Trakl. Now, silently look at the color scheme and look at the feel of the poem. Now, silently gathers in the grazing lands a red cloud. Color, dominant color in expressionist palette is red. Even T.S. Eliot in Wasteland uses expressionist coloring coming under the shadow of this red rock, he says. Red rock, and I will show you something different from either, etc. A red cloud, the dwelling of an angry god, ingested with blood. So red, blood, a cool moon under its roads and the putrid blackness. How proud is the desolation on whose altars today the spirits scorching flames. Again, color, you got the color scheme of scorching flames, draw on the vast suffering of unborn children still. When you speak about expressionism, there is a very strong use of expressionism in American theater. For example, when you teach Eugene O'Neill or Tennessee Williams particularly, there is a strong use of expressionism there. And if you read the stage description of Emperor John's by Eugene O'Neill, there is a predominance of the color red there. The whole scene is set in red and white. Extreme color dialectic, color opposition. And Tennessee Williams insisted, he quarreled with many of his directors, insisted that the lighting of his plays should be as eerie as in the paintings of El Greco, a predecessor ancestor of expressionist movement. So we cannot teach American theater, especially the plays of O'Neill or Tennessee Williams, without capturing the essence of expressionist art. Along with expressionist paintings, Munch, another prescribed painting is Carlo, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbirds. Now, Carlo was not a self-proclaimed expressionist, but you can find, of course, the life experience, the painful, traumatic experience manifests itself in many of these paintings. She in an accident, she fractured her spine, and she was in braces, steel braces all her life. At the same time, very energetic, it could not be suppressed. one of the prototypes of feminist art, Mexican painter, self-portrait with necklace. And then Kafka's Metamorphosis is prescribed. I told you how claustrophobic and threatening the whole experience is. Then Robert Wayne, Cabinet of Caligari, how the theme of insanity and irrationality figures there. You can associate films, especially expressionist films and, film noir films with even Baroque kind of lighting, light and shade. Then with Picasso, we come to Cubism. Picasso's Guernica is the prescribed painting. Whereas I think when you explain Guernica in the class, you may have to go to the whole grammar of Cubism. What did Cubism do? Cubism was the prime modernist movement that rejected, I told you, absolutely the visual art grammar that continued from Renaissance up to modern period, the grammar of perspective, the rule of perspective. Now, Cubism utterly does away with realistic rendering by cancelling out the foreground and background. I told you early designs, I show you how in Gestalt you can confuse the spacing of foreground and background, and you can find that manifested in Picasso's earliest Cubist painting, La Damoiselle d'Avignon, the Women of Avignon. You can't distinguish the foreground from the background. You can focus on one, then it will advance as the foreground. And figures are abstracted into geometric shapes, geometric patterns, basic geometric patterns. And this illustrates the process in which Picasso paints a Cubist painting. He starts painting very realistically, extremely realistically, and starts removing all that is inessential step by step. And by the time you come to the last stage, this is the bull. Quintessential bull. From this bull, 11th bull, if you remove one single line, the bull may suffer. Now, this is the essentialist, imagination that or pursuit that Picasso involved in. He says it is very easy to look at the appearance of things, but can you go beyond the appearance to grasp the essence of a thing, the thisness of a thing? That was the spirit of Cubism, reducing the whole visual reality to the basic elemental design. And it is very geometric in spirit. And with Cubism, modern art approximates design, the idea of design. And surrealism, this painting deals with surrealism. Dali, I think Dali, not directly prescribed, but I think a movie on Dali, somehow Dali figures in that syllabus. Salvador Dali, though he was dismissed from surrealist movement, he is the most celebrated surrealist painter. And the persistence of memory in this painting, persistence of memory, you find the whole thing is dreamlike. He calls it the famous soft clocks, the soft, crazy, lonely, paranoid, critical camembert of time and space. Camembert is cheese. Now, on the surface of it, the whole painting looks so illogical and so irrational. And the aim of surrealism was to explore the world of the unconscious and bring out and salvage certain images, oniric images, dreamlike images that will have a higher quantum of reality. That is why they're called surrealism, superior realism. And this kind of realism, superior realism, operates on the principle of analogy. Principle of analogy, very much, analogy and metaphor, they are used in literature very much. Creative writing is nothing without metaphorical imagination and analogical, thinking. Now, analogical thinking can be explained in terms of a definition given by Lautréamont, French philosopher Lautréamont, about surrealism. He spoke about surrealism as beautiful as a chance encounter between a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissection table. He said, surrealism is as beautiful as a chance encounter, the accidental meeting between an umbrella and a sewing machine, where in a hospital operation theater on an operation table. Purely accidental, happenstance, you can say, and you shouldn't put them there deliberately. But if it happens so, that's the best moment of surrealism, he said. So on the surface of it, it's so absurd, so irrational. Nothing like that can take place to the common sense. But if you think deeply, analogically, there is an deep inherent relationship between a sewing machine and an umbrella. You can't make an umbrella without using a sewing machine. Some kind of stitching is involved in an umbrella. So the sewing machine and an umbrella are brought together with the single idea of stitching. Then, if you think of an operation theater, what does a surgeon do in an operation theater? Stitching, suture, you call it suturing. In film theory, is also used the term suture. An editor is a surgeon suturing different shots. So the idea of stitching, how the idea of stitching unites these discordant images together and fuse them into an alembic of an overall imagination, what T.S. Eliot spoke about as the unification of sensibility. How these different images are brought together, unified into a kind of poetic or visual experience. An encounter between an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissection table. Now here, in this painting, what is the logic? The logic of this apparently illogical painting is that in literature, when you speak about time, passage of time, we speak about the stream of time. Time flows. In metaphorical language, you say time flows. If in literature, you can use the expression time flows, why can't you show time flowing in terms of melting clocks? Now, this was Dali's aim, to capture the melting cheese of time and space, camembert of time and space. Paranoid critical method. And surrealism, in the definition given by Dali, is a paranoid critical method. It's a paranoid method because it verges on insanity. Its raw material are the images of the unconscious. They have to be salvaged. But it's a critical method. Critical method in that you consciously explore your unconscious and bring out these dream images, which have a higher, quantity of reality, a superior kind of reality, psychological reality. And when you speak about Henry James, who introduced psychological realism, he said psychological realism is more realistic in a sense than the so-called social realism or objective realism. And he said, I can write volumes of novel, so many volumes of a novel with just only one picture, the picture of a girl, teenage girl sitting in her study room, her face supported by her hand, her chin supported by her hand. Just one casual picture is enough for me to write a voluminous novel, Henry James said. What is there? What is the theme? He says, I don't need any Spanish main or gold coin. He was actually having a quarrel with R.L. Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island. I can write a whole novel because, the girl may be sitting, she is inexperienced, she may be sitting in a room, she is doing nothing. But think of what is happening in her mind, what is going on in her mind. Just for 1 minute, if you can capture her thoughts, that would be enough material for a novel. That is what stream of consciousness writers used. Writers of interior monologue used. And this was the kind of realism that surrealists wanted to articulate. Another painting by Dali, Temptation of Saint Anthony. Now the prescribed poem here is Max Weber, Cubist poet, along with Picasso. Cubes, high, low, high, and higher, far, out, far, planes, etc. This Cubist poem may appear very absurd on the surface, but then if you know what Picasso was doing, he was actually taking an object and walking around that object and composing that object from different angles on the same plane. So he was walking around an object and trying to depict all these angular perspectival details into one canvas, into one picture. And actually Cubism was approximating to sculpture. Cubism was an attempt, visual art attempt, to approximate towards sculpture. It aspired to assume the solidity of the sculpture, three-dimensional solidity of a sculpture. So this idea was taken up by Cubist writers like Gertrude Stein and here Max Weber, prescribed poet Max Weber. Now they will take up one situation and they will walk around that situation, walk around indefinitely and repeatedly, and from different angles they will state the same situation in different ways, but the situation will be the same. And that will form one exclusive composition. The famous Cubist sentence by Gertrude Stein is, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Repetitions. But the interesting thing is that with every repetition, the rose undergoes some change. By the time you come to second rose, you come to the second rose with the memory of the first rose in your mind. There is a kind of residual Derridian trace that you carry from one rose to another. By the time you come to the fourth rose, it is so dense actually. The fourth rose you conceive as something very dense. And this kind of density, sculptural density, Cubist writers try to achieve. And you may have to explain Cubism by explaining the experience of visualizing sculptures, introducing sculptural imagination. The Woman and the Frame, prescribed along with surrealist painters like Dali. So many surrealist elements are given there. Now here, postmodern period in the syllabus comes with Banksy. Banksy, love is in their flower thrower. Banksy, when you speak about postmodernism, it's very difficult to define postmodernism. Postmodernism is actually a kind of extended modernism, but then the revolutionary edge is lost. Somebody called postmodern a kind of hover culture. Modernism is over, but a new order is not being born. So somewhere between you range. But whatever was serious in modernism became a kind of mimicry in postmodernism. Mimicry, then pastiche, then collages, then performances, all these kinds of things. In paintings, for example, from pop art, when you come to postmodern art, this kind of reduction of the palette through screen printing and all, you find very minimal palette used, broadly uniform application of red and black in this painting. A man wearing a mask and a hat is throwing a bunch of flowers, a bouquet of flowers. Now there is violence there, gesture of violence there, but the gesture actually conveys a kind of craving for peace. He stands for peace. The painting symbolizes the craving for world peace, but the gesture is violent. Now how this violent gesture is articulated to express a very, very soothing theme of world peace. The interesting thing is that Banksy was actually a kind of what you call graffiti painter. His name, Banksy, is actually pseudonymous. We don't know his actual name. He was a guerrilla painter, graffiti painter, just like Basquiat. Influence of Basquiat you can find in this British painter, Banksy. And the use of color and all these things, you can relate Banksy to a postmodern spirit. This is Basquiat, actually, a street painter whom Andy Warhol discovered and promoted, and he finally died due to heavy drug addiction. It was a kind of actually suicide, virtual suicide through drug addiction. Basquiat was a street painter, a very interesting painter. This is Basquiat. Postmodernism, these are certain characteristics you can find, anywhere. Now, this painting is interesting by Jasper Johns, Raising Thoughts. Now, I want to summarize the whole idea of postmodernism in this painting, Raising Thoughts. This is a collage, actually. We have the picture of Mona Lisa, then Camus you have here, then certain drawings by Jasper Johns, and certain postures are added, some elements are included. One thing you find, frame within a frame, the use of micro frames, the micro frames. Now, in such a composition, I mentioned certain postmodern metafiction like If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler, and the stories of Italo Calvino, and so many postmodern stories like that use frame within frame, micro frames, and the presence of frames within frames, or so many frames. You can't say frame within a frame, but each frame demands our attention. Actually, there is a kind of simultaneity of these different frames which demand a kind of equal attention. And this kind of painting, the kind of reading this painting invites is a kind of browsing. This painting can be read as a kind of browsing. You browse from one frame to another, and the totality of the whole experience is a kind of meandering, simultaneous experience. The experience of browsing, and the freedom is there. No focus is given on any object. The reader is free to focus on any part and start reading the painting from left to right or right to left, from top to bottom, bottom to top. This is the kind of quality of browsing that some postmodern fiction, as I told you, especially metafictional writings introduce. Then finally, to conclude, I will come to certain aspects where visual arts and literature become very, very crucial and interesting when you think of feminist art. Feminism and feminist art and ecofeminism and all these things. Most of the feminist movements can be understood in terms of visual art manifestations. And here, this is Judy Chicago, American painter, Rainbow Warrior. Now, women painters, most of the feminist painters, women painters, they try to convey the idea of the energy that women only have, men don't possess, which they call Jayarman. Here, the whole woman is depicted as a universal mother embracing the whole universe, the earth and the sky, the sea and the sky. Overarching figure of the woman is a mother figure, as a universal mother figure. This mother figure is very crucial to understanding feminist art. Judy Chicago, another painting, Earth Birth, how a universal mother is giving birth to earth, and how the Jayarman is radiating in ripples around her. This is Demeter and Persephone. Demeter and Persephone, we know the story of Demeter and Persephone. Persephone was agricultural, goddess of agriculture. Demeter was goddess of agriculture. She was a daughter of Gaia, who was also goddess of agriculture. And Gaia consciousness is very much in the eco-critical domain today. And Persephone was Demeter's daughter, who was abducted by Pluto, just like Persephone. Just like Proserpine. The same story. Proserpine was abducted by Pluto for eating from the pomegranate. No, Persephone was abducted because, Pluto had an eye on her and he took her away to the underworld, and Demeter fought and got her daughter back for 6 months. She will live along with her mother and 6 months underground, just as in the story of Proserpine. This is a vegetation myth actually. This is a vegetation myth, how periodically nature becomes fruitful in spring and nature dies in winter, the eternal cyclical regeneration and death of nature is embodied in these myths of Demeter and Persephone. But interesting thing is that this is one story where a strong bond between mother and daughter is articulated. Now, an important theme for feminist writers and feminist painters is this bond between, the kind of sisterhood or kind of camaraderie between women, conscientizing women about their own problems. And they argue that, or we know that the strongest bond, understanding bond in the world is between a mother and a daughter. But very significantly in visual art history, either Eastern or Western, we miss the depiction of a girl child. It's very interesting. It's very interesting how, what kind of space is given to a girl child in figuration in Western art or even in Indian art. All Madonna and the child, there is no Madonna and the child where a girl child is depicted. But this story, they are taking up this story. Feminist performance artists and writers are taking up this story of Demeter and Persephone and reinserting this bond as a very strong, meaningful, rejuvenating theme for womanhood in the contemporary times. For example, Susan Benton, she's a sculptor, very tough sculptor working in iron. This is a mask she made, Demeter mask. She wears it one way, she is Demeter, another way she is Persephone, and yet another way she is Pluto. She performs all over the world. She even came to Mumbai, and performed this Demeter performance wearing a mask. This is Rachel Rosenthal performance as Goya, that is Demeter's wife, agricultural goddess, universal mother, Goya. This is a painting Demeter and Persephone and Pluto's world underground. This was my humble contribution to the theme of mother-daughter relationship. I painted this for a camp, All Kerala camp, Demeter and Persephone. Thank you so much.